was absolutely brilliant at astrophysics. But as often happens, people wander outside their field. And there's a lovely quote by Richard Feynman, who won the Nobel Prize for Physics. Richard Feynman said, outside their own field of expertise, the scientist is just as dumb as anybody else. Now, I need to take that on board myself, because I'm talking outside my field. But you see, this statement, here's the explanation. Because there is a law like gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. When I first read that, I thought, come again? Because there is a law like gravity, that is, because there is something, the universe will create itself from nothing. That is a logical contradiction to start with. But it's worse. The universe will create itself, so he says. Well, if I say X creates Y, roughly you've got the idea, if you've got X, you can produce Y. If I say X creates X itself, then I would want to say that nonsense remains nonsense, even if a high-powered scientist says it. It is logically incoherent. But it's worse still than that. There's a third degree of difficulty here. Because there is a law like gravity. Now, of course, you've seen he's avoided the question, where do these laws come from? But you can't have laws without a universe that they describe. That's what laws are. But are laws creative? Think of Newton's laws of motion. I watched a bit of the Masters snooker and admired the genius of these people who can. And I think always of Newton's laws when I watch snooker. But Newton's law of motion never moved a snooker ball in the history of the universe. People with cues move the balls. The laws describe, they don't cause. So there's an absolutely fundamental philosophical mistake here. And I find myself agreeing, although I'll say again, Hawking was brilliant mathematically. I agree with Lord Martin Rees, who said that I know Stephen Hawking well, and he knows nothing about theology and very little about philosophy, and I wouldn't listen to him on either subject. But you see, the problem is when a scientist of his capacity makes a statement, as he did in later life, that there was no God, it troubles people. Now, I wrote a little book called God and Stephen Hawking. Whose design is it anyway? And I want to tell you why I wrote the book. I got a letter from my home country from a young man who'd been driving past a petrol station, and there's a big newspaper hoarding, Hawking says there's no God. And he said, I was so distressed by this, I nearly crashed the car. And he wrote to me and he said, if Stephen Hawking says there's no God, who am I to say there is? And my heart went out to him, so I decided to write a book. And I noticed that none of Hawking's contemporaries or colleagues have ever made the slightest attempt to answer the issues I raised, including the one I've just been through. In other words, I try to take seriously claims like this to explain, and I discover they're empty. And not only empty, but meaningless.
Right, well, I'm going to hit you with another one.
Oh, are you? Right, okay.
So Stephen Weinberg, the Nobel laureate in physics, he said this, I do indeed think we are the winners in a cosmic lottery. To which you would say?
Well, what do you mean by that exactly? I presume he means that everything just happens by chance. But it's interesting that as died-hard an atheist as Dawkins is, whom I've debated several times, Dawkins doesn't believe it happened by chance because the chances are just far too small. So what Stephen Weinberg meant, I don't know. And I'm sorry I don't know, Richard, because not long before he died, there was a debate set up between me and Weinberg in Austin, Texas. And unfortunately, he withdrew from it. But it would have been interesting to find out. Again, it seems to me that this idea that it's all by chance is something that the human mind rebels against. Now, the interesting thing about physics that I've discovered and been very interested in is their observation of the fact that the universe is fine-tuned. Now, I have a colleague in Oxford who's a professor of philosophy and an atheist, and a lot of his students are atheists. And he invited me to talk to them about God. He said, they'll roast you, but we'll give you a good dinner afterwards. I said, okay. But he said, I hope when you come that you'll use the best argument against atheism. Now, this is an atheist professor at Oxford speaking. Well, I said, if you tell me what the best argument is, I'll use it. So he did, and I used it. He said, if I were ever to become a theist or give up my atheism, it would be because of the fine-tuning of the universe. The fact that the constants of nature are so accurately set that they make possible carbon-based life. He said that is, for me, one of the things that speaks, because this is at the heart of physics. There are relatively few people, hardly any these days, who would deny it. Hawking said it's there, and it demands an explanation. And there are two explanations offered. The one is what was believed by the person that taught me quantum mechanics, Professor Sir John Polkinghorne, that it was God behind it. The other is that we live in an infinite ensemble of universes. It's the multiverse view, so that there must be a universe in which everything possible happens. And as Polkinghorne said, it's much more economical to believe in one universe behind which there is a God than in an infinite number of universes, none of which is accessible, and the evidence for them is practically zero. There is such a dominance of the worldview of naturalism in particularly the scientific establishment today. People don't get a chance of hearing arguments in the other direction, which is ironic. I am in the University of Oxford. What's its motto? Dominus illuminatio mea, the Lord is my light. And the people that founded Cambridge and Oxford and so on, centuries ago, were people who unified all branches of thinking, And God was on the intellectual agenda just as much as physics and mathematics. And we've lost that because we haven't allowed, I'm afraid, in some cases, a proper discussion in the public space of the real evidence on both sides. And that.
Here, Lennox sharpens the knife. Up to this point, he has questioned slogans. Now he dismantles a claim at the level of logic itself. The statement, "The universe creates itself," may sound profound when spoken by a famous physicist, but Lennox insists that prestige cannot rescue incoherence. Logic does not bend to reputation. His analysis is deceptively simple. Creation, by definition, presupposes a distinction between cause and effect. If X creates Y, X must exist prior to, or at least independently of, Y. To say that X creates X collapses that distinction and dissolves meaning. The sentence no longer explains anything. It violates the very grammar of causation. Lennox's line, "Nonsense remains nonsense, even if a highly honored scientist says it," is not an insult. It is a defense of rational discourse. Without logical coherence, explanation ceases to function. The problem deepens when the argument appeals to laws of nature as creative agents. Laws, as Lennox stresses, describe patterns of behavior. They do not generate behavior. Newton's laws never moved a snooker ball. They describe what happens when something acts. To treat laws as causal forces is to confuse a map with the territory, an equation with an engine. This is not a theological objection. It is a philosophical clarification that any serious scientific thinker should recognize. What makes this mistake particularly dangerous is that it wears the costume of scientific rigor. By invoking gravity, equations, and inevitability, the claim gives the impression of explanatory depth. But when examined closely, it avoids the most basic question. Where did the laws themselves come from, and why do they apply at all? Laws without a universe describe nothing. A universe without explanation remains unexplained. Appealing to laws as creators is therefore not a solution. It is an evasion. Lennox is careful, however, to model intellectual humility. He quotes Richard Feynman's warning that scientists outside their own fields can be as naive as anyone else. He includes himself in that caution. This is crucial. The critique is not scientists are foolish, but expertise in one domain does not grant immunity from logical error in another. That distinction preserves respect for science while resisting the idolization of scientists as universal authorities. The deeper implication is cultural. Modern society often substitutes authority for argument. When a celebrated figure speaks, many listeners suspend critical thinking, assuming that brilliance in one area guarantees correctness in all others. Lennox challenges that reflex. He invites the audience to recover an older intellectual virtue. Arguments must stand or fall on coherence, not credentials. So this section does more than refute a specific claim about gravity and self-creation. It calls for a disciplined way of thinking in an age dazzled by expertise. If explanations are to mean anything, they must obey the rules of logic. And if a worldview collapses those rules, no amount of scientific language can save it. Let us now continue with the debate or discussion. At this stage of the discussion, Lennox moves from logical coherence to explanatory weight. The question is no longer simply whether certain claims are contradictory, but whether they pay their way as explanations. When Steven Weinberg speaks of a cosmic lottery, Lennox does not dismiss the phrase outright. Instead, he asks the only question that matters. What does chance actually explain? Chance, properly understood, is not a cause. It is a description of our ignorance about causes. To say something happened by chance is to say we do not know or are not specifying the conditions that led to it. That may be legitimate in everyday contexts, but it becomes problematic when elevated to an ultimate explanation of reality itself. Lennox's observation that even Richard Dawkins does not believe life arose purely by chance is telling. If the probabilities are astronomically small, invoking chance does not solve the problem, it intensifies it. This is where fine-tuning enters the discussion. The constants of nature are not loosely arranged. They are balanced within extraordinarily narrow ranges that make life possible. Lennox's anecdote about the atheist philosophy professor at Oxford is striking precisely because it comes from the other side. When a committed atheist admits that fine-tuning is the strongest reason he could imagine for abandoning atheism, it reveals something important. This is not a fringe religious argument. It is embedded in the heart of contemporary physics. The multiverse is often presented as a rescue strategy. If there are infinitely many universes, then it is not surprising that at least one appears fine-tuned for life. But Lennox, following thinkers like John Polkinghorne, presses the issue of explanatory economy. The multiverse multiplies entities beyond necessity, introduces realms that are in principle unobservable, and rests on speculative physics that currently lacks empirical confirmation. In contrast, the hypothesis of a rational creator behind one universe is conceptually simpler and metaphysically coherent. Simpler does not mean simplistic. It means it explains more with less. The deeper philosophical move here is crucial. Lennox is not claiming fine-tuning proves God in a knockdown mathematical sense. He is arguing that it demands an explanation, and that not all explanations are equally reasonable. Rational inquiry is not just about what is possible, it is about what is plausible given the evidence. When naturalism insists that chance plus necessity is sufficient, it shoulders an immense explanatory burden, and often avoids acknowledging that burden. This leads to Lennox's cultural critique. He notes the dominance of naturalism within the scientific establishment, not as a scientific conclusion, but as a worldview assumption. The irony is sharp. Institutions founded on the conviction that God illuminates human reason now hesitate to allow God onto the intellectual agenda at all. The loss is not theological only, it is philosophical. By excluding certain explanations in advance, the conversation becomes narrower, not deeper. So this section reframes the debate. The issue is not science versus God, but which worldview best explains the data we already have. Fine-tuning stands as a stubborn fact. Whether one follows it toward God or away from him, it cannot simply be waved aside with the word chance, without paying an explanatory price. Let us now continue with the debate or discussion.
That's why I debated Dawkins, Singer, and all the rest of them.
Well, that's a good point, because you've had all of these debates. You say they're terrifying. As you've gone through this, with all of these public debates, have you ever felt concerned that science will actually end up burying your God? I know you've written a book on it, but tell us about why.
No, I've never felt that. And that I say that with some hesitation in the sense that it sounds arrogant. But I started, you see, let me put it another way. People often say to me, putting your question in different words, do you ever doubt? Now, doubt tends to have two meanings. And the most common meaning is that sinking feeling that everything's going black and there's no hope and so on, and you're in darkness and you'll never get out of it. That kind of depressive doubt. But there's another kind of doubt. You see, the word doubt in English comes from the Latin word dubitare, to be in two minds, essentially. Now, I have spent my life doubting my Christian faith in that second sense. I've never had the deep depressive feeling that it's all going to pieces. But the reason I'm sitting here talking to you tonight is because I have questioned and questioned and questioned and questioned. And I take the views of other people very seriously. It seems to me this is absolutely crucial for myself as a Christian to take the arguments of people that oppose Christianity seriously. Read their books. Just a little story. I first met Hitchens, and I said, "You're a contrarian, aren't you?" in the first 2 minutes. "You're a contrarian." "Oh," he said, "how do you know that?" I said, "I read your book." And he just stopped. He said, "You what?" I said, "You heard me. I read your book." He said, "Did you really read my book?" I said, "Yes." He was staggered that I would read his book, as if that wasn't the normal thing to do when you're debating someone. And I said, "I've got a question for you." I said, "Why do you get almost all your arguments from one source?" He said, "Do I?" I said, "Yes." "What's the source?" "Tom Paine." He said, "You're right." And immediately with a rapport, which was interesting, and you can see what happened if you watch the debate. But that kind of attitude of reading what other people think, I think what I've discovered is the answers come in the Christian faith. And when you take that whole general thing, the idea of scientism, now I'm not going to go into it, but that's the notion that science is the only way to truth. I'm very concerned about
This section marks a tonal shift from cosmology to character. Lennox turns inward, not to weaken his case, but to strengthen it by modeling what responsible belief looks like under pressure. When he addresses doubt, he refuses the simplistic binary that dominates public discourse. Either you are certain and faithful, or you doubt and therefore fail. Instead, he distinguishes between two kinds of doubt, one emotional and paralyzing, the other intellectual and exploratory. The second kind of doubt, which Lennox openly embraces, is not a threat to faith. It is a discipline. To be in two minds is to take competing arguments seriously, to resist intellectual laziness, and to refuse to insulate one's beliefs from scrutiny. Lennox's lifelong practice of questioning his own faith does not signal instability. It signals confidence that truth can withstand examination. A belief that cannot be questioned is not strong, it is fragile. His anecdote about Christopher Hitchens sharpens this point. Lennox does something surprisingly rare. He reads his opponent's work carefully. That simple act, "I read your book," creates genuine dialogue because it communicates respect for the other person as a thinking agent. Debate without listening becomes theater. Debate grounded in understanding becomes inquiry. Lennox implies that many public arguments fail not because the issues are insoluble, but because the participants refuse to engage the strongest form of the opposing view. This posture directly undermines scientism. Scientism claims that science alone delivers truth, but Lennox exposes its fatal flaw. That statement itself is not a scientific conclusion. It cannot be measured, tested, or derived from an experiment. Therefore, if it is true, It is not scientifically true. And if scientific truth is the only truth, the statement collapses. This is not a rhetorical trick. It is a straightforward, logical analysis. Scientism saws off the branch on which it sits. What makes this critique powerful is its restraint. Lennox does not dismiss science. He honors it. He is a scientist speaking as a scientist who knows precisely what science can and cannot do. The problem is not scientific success. It is philosophical overreach. When science is turned into a worldview, it becomes something it was never meant to be. A total explanation of reality rather than a powerful tool for investigating part of it. The broader implication is cultural. A society that equates truth with technique will struggle to address questions of meaning, value, and purpose. These questions do not disappear when ignored. They resurface as anxiety, polarization, and identity crises. Lennox's argument suggests that intellectual humility, knowing the limits of one's methods, is not a weakness. It is a prerequisite for wisdom. So this section reframes doubt as a virtue and exposes scientism as an illusion of certainty. Faith, in Lennox's account, does not fear questions. It fears only the refusal to ask them honestly. Let us now continue with the debate or discussion.